They said her name would never be remembered, just another young woman who worked small jobs and tried too hard in a world that didn't care. Until the night a forgotten file was opened in a dusty marine archive, revealing a single phrase scrawled across the top in red ink. Iron Viper. Do not forget. And someone hadn't. That's why this story matters. And if you believe that sometimes the smallest ember of resilience can survive long enough to spark a fire, then like and subscribe. Because what you're about to hear is the kind of journey that reminds us why we never, ever count someone out. She was in her late 20s, not a soldier, not a commander, not someone anyone would look at twice in a crowd. But she carried the quiet ache of someone who had tried everything and been met with slammed doors every single time. From the outside, her life looked ordinary. Long shifts at a diner, a roommate she could barely afford rent with, textbooks stacked on her nightstand from classes she had to drop when tuition became too much. But the truth was, she lived every day with the weight of failure pressing down on her chest. She wanted more, always had. Wanted to prove that she wasn't the fragile, delicate dreamer people said she was in high school. But every time she reached for something, it seemed to slip through her fingers like sand. She had a sharp mind, a good heart, but no connections, no financial safety net, no family cheering her on. Her parents loved her, yes, but their kind of love came wrapped in resignation. Maybe it's time you stop pushing so hard. Maybe a simple life is all you need. She hated those words, hated how they made her feel small, as if wanting something bigger for herself was selfish or impossible. She tried everything, nights studying coding tutorials, mornings applying to corporate jobs, afternoons scrubbing dishes in kitchens just to pay the bills. The cycle of rejection letters became so predictable she stopped opening them, just sliding the envelopes into a shoebox under her bed, as if hiding them could erase the sting. Her friends weren't cruel, but their silence was louder than any insult. They stopped asking her how her projects were going, stopped offering encouragement, because in their eyes, she had already failed. At family gatherings, she heard the whispers. She's still chasing that dream? Still hasn't settled down. The truth? She was exhausted. There were nights she sat on her apartment floor, head against the peeling paint, wondering if maybe they were right. Maybe she wasn't cut out for more. She thought of all the versions of herself that had been beaten down over the years. The little girl told she was too clumsy to run track. The teenager mocked for trying out for debate. The college student laughed at when she said she wanted to build something meaningful one day. It was like the world had been holding her down, hand on her shoulder, whispering, "Know your place." But deep inside, in a place even she barely remembered, there was another voice. One that came from a single moment years earlier. A day when she'd almost given up during a marine mentorship program she'd stumbled into during college, back when she thought maybe discipline could save her. She had collapsed in the dirt during a field drill, gasping, ready to quit, when a voice cut through the chaos. A Marine captain named Reynolds stood there, arms crossed, but his eyes didn't mock her. They burned with something else. He called her by a name she didn't even know was hers until that moment. Iron Viper, advance. The words echoed in her chest, heavier than any insult, sharper than any doubt. It was ridiculous. She wasn't strong. She wasn't special. But the way he said it, as if it was already true, forced her to push herself back up. She finished the drill that day, though her legs shook, though tears burned her eyes. And afterward, she told herself it was just a moment, just a nickname. But here she was, nearly a decade later, with those same words, flickering in the corners of her memory like a fading light bulb. Most days she ignored them. Most days she believed the world's verdict on her. Too ordinary, too fragile, too lost. Yet even as she sank into another evening of ramen noodles and unpaid bills, even as she stacked plates at work and smiled through aching feet, that name, Iron Viper, would slip into her thoughts. What did he see that she couldn't? Why had he said it as though it was a fact? She didn't know. But she would soon find out that she hadn't been forgotten, and that somewhere out there, a Marine captain was about to make a phone call that would crack her world wide open. When the call finally came, it was late. One of those nights where exhaustion felt like a second skin and silence pressed down heavier than sleep. Her phone buzzing against the chipped laminate counter as she debated whether to ignore it like every other unknown number. Until something, maybe instinct, maybe fate, made her swipe. The voice on the other end was steady, deliberate, the kind of tone that carried authority without needing to shout. "This is Captain Reynolds." For a moment she thought it was a mistake, or worse, a cruel prank dredged from her past. But then came the words that froze her in place as if time itself had cracked. "Iron Viper, advance." Her heart stuttered in her chest, breath caught between disbelief and memory, and suddenly she was back in that dirt field years ago, stumbling, collapsing, and rising again only because someone believed she could. For years she told herself that nickname meant nothing, that it was just a spur-of-the-moment tactic from a mentor who had long since forgotten her name. But hearing it again, after everything, after all the failures and the nights alone, was like someone throwing open a door she thought had been bricked shut. She didn't speak at first, didn't trust her voice, and Reynolds filled the silence, explaining in clipped phrases how he'd kept track of her over the years, not in detail, but enough to know she had fought through more obstacles than most ever see. He told her he was heading a new initiative, a nonprofit backed by Marines and veterans designed to bridge the gap for struggling families. Housing, job placement, mentorship, the works, and they needed someone who could lead with grit. Someone who understood hardship not from textbooks, but from living it. She almost laughed, the sound brittle, because surely he had the wrong person. Surely she wasn't the kind of leader he imagined. She was just a waitress with too many debts, a dropout with more unopened rejection letters than paychecks. But Reynolds cut through her self-doubt the same way he had years ago. "I know who you are. I named you Iron Viper for a reason. You endure. You don't break. That's what this mission needs." She tried to argue, tried to list all the reasons she wasn't qualified, wasn't enough. But he interrupted only once, his tone softening in a way that was somehow more commanding than any order. "You've already survived what would have ended most. That's leadership. And I'm not offering you charity. I'm asking you to take command." The word struck deeper than she wanted to admit. No one had ever asked her to lead anything. No one had ever spoken to her, as if she was capable of more than scraping by. For days after that call, she walked around in a fog, the ordinary rhythm of her life. Coffee refills, rent checks, late-night walks home. Suddenly infused with a question that refused to leave. What if he was right? She found herself remembering not just the field drill but the small moments from that mentorship program. The way the other recruits looked at her when she refused to quit. The way Reynolds had nodded once, silently, after she'd carried her pack farther than anyone expected. Maybe she had buried those memories too deep, too ashamed to believe they meant anything. And yet here was proof that they had mattered, that someone had been watching when she thought no one cared. The decision wasn't easy. Accepting Reynolds's offer meant stepping into a world she didn't understand, risking failure on a scale much larger than personal dreams. It meant being responsible for others, for veterans who had given everything and families who had nowhere else to turn. The weight of it terrified her. But then came the thought that finally tipped the balance. If she could endure years of stumbling alone, maybe she could endure this too, and maybe, just maybe, turn that endurance into something bigger than herself. On the third night after the call, she texted him a single word: advance. And with that, the life she thought was set in stone began to shift, as the woman the world had written off prepared to become the Iron Viper once more. She didn't sleep the night she sent that one-word text, advance, because once the message left her phone, the weight of the decision settled into her bones. And for the first time in years, it wasn't the crushing weight of failure, but the staggering weight of possibility. The kind that keeps you staring at the ceiling in a half-lit apartment while the city outside hums along, indifferent, unaware that something inside you has shifted. The next morning came with a call from Reynolds, crisp as always, giving her the details. There would be a meeting, not formal but important, veterans gathering to lay the groundwork for the initiative, and he wanted her there not as a guest, but as someone with a seat at the table. She nearly turned him down, fear gnawing at her, whispering all the old lines. "You're not qualified. You're not smart enough. You'll embarrass yourself." But she forced herself to remember the nickname he'd given her, Iron Viper, and how it wasn't a request or a suggestion. It was an identity he saw in her even when she couldn't. That evening she stood in front of her mirror, fumbling with the only blazer she owned, a thrift store find 2 years old, and told herself that looking the part didn't matter nearly as much as showing up. She took the bus across town, heart pounding, palms damp, until she walked into the community center where the meeting was held, and the first thing she noticed was the room itself. Folding chairs, coffee urns, scarred tables. But the second thing she noticed was the eyes of the men and women in uniform pieces, veterans who carried themselves with a gravity she could never fake. They turned toward her not with judgment but curiosity, and Reynolds, standing at the front, greeted her with that same steady nod he'd given years ago in the dirt field, a gesture that said more than words. You belong here. The meeting wasn't glamorous. It was gritty, raw, veterans speaking about families on the brink of eviction, kids growing up without stable homes, soldiers returning from service unable to find work, pride clashing with desperation. She listened more than she spoke, but when Reynolds asked her opinion on how to structure outreach, the room quieted, and for a terrifying moment, she thought of bolting. But then she thought of all the rejection letters under her bed, all the time she'd been dismissed, and something inside her snapped, not in defeat, but in defiance. She leaned forward, voice shaking at first but steadier with each word, outlining what it felt like to fall through the cracks, to scrape by, to feel invisible. She told them she wasn't a Marine, she wasn't decorated or trained like they were, but she knew the sting of being written off, and she believed that made her exactly the kind of person who could speak to families who felt the same. When she finished, silence hung in the air, and she was sure she'd ruined everything. Until one of the older veterans, his arm in a sling, nodded slowly and said, "That's the fight we need. Someone who gets it." That was the first time she believed she might actually belong. The weeks that followed were a blur of work like she had never known. Drafting proposals, cold calling businesses, visiting shelters, building spreadsheets late into the night, learning 100 new skills on the fly because failure wasn't just about her anymore. It would mean families losing a lifeline. Every setback felt sharper now, every misstep heavier, but for the first time the weight pushed her forward instead of down. Reynolds checked in often, never coddling, always reminding her that leadership wasn't about perfection but persistence. He told her, "Every leader doubts themselves, Iron Viper. The difference is you keep moving anyway." And she did. She moved through exhaustion, through doubt, through the quiet fear that at any moment someone would discover she wasn't good enough. And yet with every step, others began to follow. Volunteers who believed in her vision, donors moved by her honesty, families who looked at her not as a savior, but as proof that resilience mattered. Her apartment became an office, stacks of files climbing the walls, her phone buzzing at all hours. There were nights she sat on the floor surrounded by paperwork, tears of frustration burning her eyes, wanting to quit, and then she would remember the sound of Reynolds's voice, "Iron Viper, advance," and she would wipe her face and keep going. Slowly, the initiative grew. First a few families helped, then dozens, then hundreds. They secured housing for veterans who had been sleeping in cars, jobs for parents who had given up hope, mentorship programs for kids who needed role models. Local news caught wind of it, painting her as a determined young woman leading a movement she had no business leading by the world's standards. But the veterans knew better, and so did she. She wasn't leading because she was flawless. She was leading because she refused to quit. The turning point came at a fundraiser, her first time speaking in front of a large audience, the room filled with donors, officials, and veterans in dress uniforms. She stood at the podium, knees trembling, lights glaring, and for a heartbeat she thought she'd choke. But then she spotted Reynolds in the crowd, arms crossed, that same look in his eyes he'd given her years ago, and she felt the words rise like a tide she couldn't stop. She told them her story, not polished, not sugar-coated. She told them about the nights of failure, the shoebox of rejection letters, the moments she wanted to give up, and how a single call had reminded her that she was Iron Viper. She told them that resilience wasn't reserved for soldiers or heroes, but for anyone who kept moving forward despite the weight pressing down. When she finished, the room rose to its feet, and for the first time she realized the nickname wasn't just a lifeline anymore. It was hers. Years passed, and the initiative became more than she ever dreamed, spreading across states, building networks of support, saving lives she would never even know about. She was no longer the woman who sat on her apartment floor wondering if she mattered. She was the leader of something greater, something built on the foundation of her own brokenness turned into strength. And yet she never forgot the moment it all began, the voice that had called her back to herself. One evening, after another long day of meetings and planning, she sat across from Reynolds in his office, both older now, both worn but unbowed. He looked at her with a quiet pride and said, "I told you, you were Iron Viper all along." She smiled, not with disbelief this time, but with the steady certainty of someone who had lived it, and she replied, "And now it's my turn to make sure others hear the same call." And so the girl who once believed she was nothing more than her failures became the woman who turned them into fuel, who showed the world that endurance was not weakness but power, that the struggles she had fought alone were never wasted. They had trained her for this mission. She had advanced, not because the path was easy, but because she finally understood that the command wasn't about winning. It was about moving forward, step by step, until the weight became wings. And somewhere in the silence of memory, the call still echoed, a reminder for anyone listening that sometimes all it takes to change a life is 3 words. Iron Viper, advance.